I'm Betsy Wiesman. I am the curator and head of the Department of Northern European Paintings here at the National Gallery. As many of you know, the exhibition Vermeer's Secrets has been open for a couple of weeks now. Some of you may have had an opportunity to see it already, whether earlier or just prior to today's lecture. Others of you may have only heard about it through some kind of sensationalistic headlines we got. And this is under the rubric of all press is good press. What was interesting to us was that we shared a very, complete press release with our colleagues, our journalism colleagues. And the one thing they focused on out of all of this was, oh my gosh, a Vermeer is no longer a Vermeer. Okay, so this is headline grabbing news, but what I wanted to do today is to go underneath those headlines as well as underneath the paintings to give you a fuller idea of the research that I and my colleagues here at the National Gallery have done over the past 2.5 years. 2.5 years, this is kind of a time frame that I think has resonance in everybody's brain because you think, oh, pandemic, 2.5 years. I learned to bake bread. I propagated cacti. I did lots of needlepoint. No, we researched Vermeer. It's the kind of people we are. These are the people we are. This is our Vermeer Dream Team, our researchers from the National Gallery of Art. And you can see that there's 7 of us, and each of us has a different sort of specialism within the field of art and conservation and scientific research. Here we are on one of our weekly Zoom meetings. But a lot of the work also went on at the gallery, behind the scenes. And here I show you a couple of shots of the Chemical Imaging Lab, which is ruled over by John Delaney and Kate Dooley and Leisha Glinsman, who all do what we call macroscopic chemical imaging. And I'll get into that a little more later. And then we have the Paintings Conservation Lab with our colleague Dina Anshin at the microscope. And then that leaves Alex Libby and myself, the art historian curator. And what we do is not so Instagram worthy to show us at work. So this was the best I could do. Little shout out to our graphic arts collection. So yes, we were the curators behind this. Now, we had great material to work with during our period. And here we have just a shot of the 4 paintings by and attributed to Vermeer in the National Gallery of Art. As many of you know, this museum has a long and storied history of research into the paintings by Vermeer. And in fact, my predecessor, Arthur Wheelock, is really one of the great scholars of Vermeer studies, beginning with his start at the gallery in the mid-1970s and coming to a great groundbreaking point with the exhibition that he organized in 1995-96, a huge monographic exhibition on Vermeer. Some of you may remember lines around the block, waiting in the snowstorm. And there was also, I think, a government shutdown at the time, which from our perspective just heightened the anticipation. Would I be able to see the exhibition? So together with Arthur, our colleagues Melanie Gifford researched the paintings very intensively. And the work that they did in the 1990s really laid the groundwork for what we did over the past 2.5 years. And another high point in that Vermeer research was a show that was done about 5 years ago called Vermeer and the Masters, which considered Vermeer in the context of his colleagues and competitors in 17th century Dutch genre painting. And that gave us another perspective on the artist, his technique, his materials, and how they fit with what his colleagues were doing at the time. So some of the techniques that research brought us to a very complete or pretty complete understanding of the artist and his materials. But in the past few years, we have had great advances in our imaging technology. And this is particularly the work of my colleague, John Delaney, and his colleague, Kate Dooley, which expands our understanding of what's going on beneath the visible surface of the painting. And one of the great things about the sort of imaging research that they do is it's non-invasive. No paintings are harmed in this study. So we're not limited, as we had been previously, by examining paintings with a microscope or through very, very tiny, limited cross-section samples that you can take from the edge of a painting or areas of pre-existing damage. But the imaging technology really gives us a much more complete and enriched understanding of the painting's materials, construction, and, to the artist's technique. So these exciting tools really provided us with the inspiration to do this study while the gallery was closed to the public. And this is an important component because, as you can understand, our Vermeer paintings, as you may know, only about 36 paintings by him survive to this day. So very rare, very coveted, and for many people, it's the first thing they make a beeline for when the gallery opens in the morning. So you can't really take them off the wall and hide them from the public without them noticing. However, if the gallery is closed to the public because of a pandemic, that enabled us to have all 4 paintings in the conservation and imaging lab for as long as we wanted. And that was such a unique opportunity to do comparative research. And we examined all 4 paintings using identical tools and technology, which we hadn't been able to do before because we didn't have all of them in the studio at the same time. Amazing opportunity. So as we approached this research, we had a number of questions. And first and foremost was, how can we take advantage of these imaging techniques in combination, in tandem with what we know and what we continue to find out using close visual examination and microscopic analysis to get closer to a fuller understanding of Vermeer's materials and techniques. And next, just to go back, how does Girl with the Red Hat differ from other paintings by Vermeer? And if you look here, just, superficially, it's quite different to the 2 paintings that are towards the left of the screen. Very different in composition, in mood, everything else. So how does that differ? And then finally, can we clarify our understanding of Girl with the Flu, which when we began our study was cataloged as attributed to Vermeer? And I'll get into that in a little more detail as we go through the presentation. But for now, I thought I would address some of our findings kind of according to how the exhibition is organized. Now, if any of you have done academic research or, something really in-depth, you know that explaining it to your non-specialist friends, family members, colleagues, you kind of have to step out of your footnotes and think about organizing and presenting your material in a slightly different manner. So we published a lot of our research in scholarly journals, but how do we present that to you, our visitors and members and friends, in a way that is engaging and makes sense? So we decided to start from what you can see on the visible surface of the painting and then get deeper into the different modalities of investigation and imaging modalities, gradually getting more and more complex. So we start you out slowly and then drop you in at the deep end. So let's have a look at the surface of this gorgeous painting by Vermeer of a lady writing. One of the things that our colleague Melanie Gifford studied during the 1990s and subsequently is the incredible delicacy and finesse with which Vermeer applies his pigments. And I show you an extreme close-up, a photomicrograph of a detail of the sleeve. And I think even on the screen, you can see that there are slightly different colors of yellow dotted and dabbled throughout this detail. Try saying that 5 times fast. But closer analysis allows us to understand that with even more specificity. And we've labeled here on the left-hand side some of the 3 of the 4 different yellow pigments that are identified both visually and chemically in the creation of this sleeve. Vermeer used 2 different types of a pigment called lead tin yellow and then yellow ochre in the warm shadows at the back of the sleeve. There's also evidence of another yellow pigment that he used, an organic pigment that has probably faded over time. But I think it indicates to you the incredible sophistication of his approach to colors and brushwork. The colorized map of the paints on the right-hand side of the screen represents the different chemical element components of the different pigments. And it's a way of reinforcing and supporting and confirming what we can see through visual analysis. Now, as we get deeper through the painting, I thought it would be a useful reminder to just give a brief overview of the construction of a typical oil painting. You start with a canvas or wood panel support. Typically, this is covered with a ground layer, a preparation layer that might be gesso that creates a smooth, neutral colored surface. And then on top of that, the yellow arrows indicate the different layers. So you have first a painted sketch, which the artist often just sketches out the major outlines of the forms in a dilute paint, usually in black or brown, and then follows that up with a colored in underpaint, which then blocks out the colors and major areas of light and shadow. What's wonderful about our new imaging techniques is that we're able to get a much clearer idea of these underlayers without the need to take physical samples. Where physical samples do exist, and I mention again that these are absolutely microscopic, dozens of them can dance on the point of a head of a pin, those samples help us understand the stratigraphy, just how those layers are constructed. And that informs our understanding of the images. So one of the imaging techniques that's used is utilizes, well, it's infrared reflectance spectroscopy, and this utilizes infrared light to exploit how the chemical components in painting materials reflect the infrared rays. So John can explain this in greater detail. There's an example of one of these imaging cameras in the exhibition. But essentially what it creates is a block of infrared images at subtly distinguished wavelengths. These are selected, colorized, overlapped, and registered to create what we call a false color infrared reflectance image. What does this tell us? It allows us to separate out information about different pigments with much greater refinement and detail than earlier technologies. And okay, now what does this tell us about a painting? I'm showing you here the false color infrared image next to the painted image of a woman holding a balance. And I'd like you to focus on two different things. One, the black areas in the false color IR at the left-hand side, and also the light on the background wall. To look at that detail on the background wall, in the visible surface, the final paint, it's a very smooth, gentle glow of light on that plaster wall. But in the false color IR, which allows us to see beneath the final paint, you can see that Vermeer has used much broader, more active brush strokes. He's almost stabbing at the canvas in these great swaths of white paint. So this suggests to us that as he's laying in the underpaint, he's going about it in a much more vigorous manner, using larger strokes and a stronger contrast of light and dark, which he then cools and refines and sort of quiets in the final image. The next thing that I wanted to take a look at is the dark area of the cloth that's bunched up on the table at the lower left-hand side of the composition. And this is really an object lesson in how incredibly useful and really essential it is to be able to harness several different technologies, because each imaging technique and each method of analysis gives you slightly different views of the data. And, if you have one set of data that tells you information in a certain category and another that tells you a different kind of information, you kind of need to weave those together to see how you can gain the most complete image of a painting, and especially what's going on underneath the surface. So here we have the false color IR, which is showing us that dark area at the left in the tablecloth. And this really indicates that Vermeer, in those dark areas that appear blue in the final paint, he's using black in an underlayer. But how can we find out more information about that? And for that, we turn to a different imaging technique, which is XRF, or X-ray fluorescence imaging spectroscopy. And this uses X-ray radiation to identify and map chemical elements such as iron, copper, or lead that are commonly found in artist pigments. And you can, using this technology, you can create maps of each different chemical element. So that gives you a lot of very specific information about the pigments. And in this one, it's the XRF map for copper. Copper is contained in the pigment verdigris. Verdigris is used as a pigment either as a colorant, a green pigment, or sometimes more frequently as a drying element. Artists added verdigris to their black pigments because black was notoriously slow drying. And they added verdigris not to give it a greenish cast, but to hurry up the drying process, the curing process. So here in the XRF map, you see areas that are dark in the final paint, dark blue, that register a greater copper component. So, we're thinking, hey, Vermeer added copper to get those blacks to dry more quickly. Well, how do we locate that in the surface of the paint or in the stratigraphy of the paint? One thing we noticed right away was that these brush strokes, which I think you can see pretty clearly in the image on the left, did not correspond to that smooth final surface that we see in the painting itself. So where do those come in? Likely in the underpaint. And it seems to us that Vermeer is using that black pigment in the underpaint, brushing it on in bold strokes, but wanting it to dry quickly so that he can get to painting that smooth, elegant, polished final surface. We also noticed that there was some kind of bolstering this assumption was that there were some areas of discrepancy in the folds that in the copper map, you can see there's an angled line that indicates a fold, whereas in the final paint, it's more of a straight line. So he made subtle adjustments between the underpaint and the final image. So examination of Woman Holding a Balance and Lady Writing helped us to establish a bit of a baseline for what we consider the hallmarks of Vermeer's techniques. One of them, this use of a copper dryer. He wasn't the only artist to do this, but we know from the the research that Melanie Gifford and Leisha Glinsman did in connection with the exhibition Vermeer and His Masters, and you remember that was about Vermeer and all of his friends and colleagues. We know that Vermeer more often used copper dryer in his underpaints than his colleagues. So this is kind of a marker for one of the characteristic features of Vermeer's technique. And the other really interesting discovery is that underpaint is much more vigorous and the brushwork is much more rough than in those final, smooth, elegant, and very calm surfaces of his genre paintings. So these were some of the characteristic features that were in our toolbox when we then went to consider Girl with the Red Hat. And how does this differ? Does it differ from those very classic genre paintings? So just, to remind you again of their compositions, on the left-hand side, the two genre paintings, women poised in a moment of quiet solitude, contemplation, whether they're completely enveloped in their own world or just, pausing to look out at us. But they're very calm and serene images, and it's mostly a fairly muted palette. But then we have Girl with the Red Hat. I mean, even in the title, Red Hat, that's kind of, a bold thing that she's wearing on her head. So we have more vibrant colors. The composition is just a half-length picture. She's turning in her chair to look us straight in the eye. There's a much stronger contrast of light and dark in this painting. It's also literally almost about a quarter of the size of these genre paintings. So it's on a quite smaller scale. And then a final, one of the other notes of difference here is that it's painted on a wood panel. instead of a canvas. And this and The Girl with the Flute are the only two paintings associated with Vermeer that are painted on a wood panel. So it's quite unusual in that respect as well. So what I wanted to focus on are some of the characteristics of Girl with the Red Hat that distinguish it from these genre paintings. One thing, apart from, I just find this such a glorious detail. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to here are the accentuated highlights here on the nose, on the face, on the lips, on the pearl earring, even in her eye. And this sort of bolder contrast of light and shadow that's really different to the subtlety of the genre paintings. And if you have a look at the Red Hat, those flicks of paint, those dots and dashes, they're really much more spontaneous and active than what he does in the genre paintings. And if you remember at the very start of this talk, I showed you the detail of the yellow sleeve. And there, the dots and dashes of paint are a little more liquid, and the paint sort of spread and pooled as it dried, creating, just sort of mellowing those dots and dashes. Very different effect here in this hat. Another detail that I find particularly striking is in this kerchief underneath her chin. And this, if you focus in on just that detail, it's incredibly abstract. But he suggested the folds and, I don't know, maybe pleats of the fabric, not by adding paint, but by using a tool and maybe just a dry brush to remove paint, to subtract it, to create texture and effect of light and transparency in this fabric. It's a beautiful technique. It's very spontaneous. It's not something that we typically find in Vermeer's finished paintings, but we do find exactly that same technique in the underpaint of some of his paintings. And here, in Girl with the Lady Riding, these marks here in the sleeve indicate where Vermeer used a tool similar to this to remove paint, to create a suggestion and a texture of folds in the fabric in the underpaint. So this was really fascinating to us to understand that in the final paint of this little study of Girl with a Red Hat, that he's adopting the techniques, the spontaneity of his underpaint. So what else can I tell you about Girl with a Red Hat that makes it unusual? I mentioned that it was painted on a wood panel. Not just a wood panel, but a wood panel that had been previously used before. We've known this since the 1970s when the painting was first X-rayed, and I show you here an X-ray of the painting rotated 180 degrees. So you might be able to see this here, which is the woman's red hat. And then down here, some of the folds of her white kerchief and her mantle. So we knew that there was this image of a man underneath, but now we have these incredible tools, imaging tools at our disposal. What more can we find out? Well, lots. So these images are included in the exhibition with a more detailed explanation, but a couple of things I wanted to draw your attention here. In the false color IR, I think what's so fascinating to me is that we start to be able to understand and separate out brushstrokes and the different layers. So, for example, here you can see the contour of the red hat. But then you also see these darker strokes underneath here that pass underneath that red hat, the shape of the red hat. So we can then associate those with the image of the man underneath. And we can also see in this hat, you may be able to make out these wonderfully, incredibly free, squiggly strokes in the brim of the hat, and these wonderful curls and ripples of his hair. And then in the XRF lead map, which allows us to pull out lead white, so white, and locate that in the layer of the underpaint. And John can explain technically how he does that. But you can see his collar, you can see his face more clearly, the contour of his hat. It's really incredible how much information we now have about a painting that we will never see in reality, but we can image it. We don't know who painted it. We don't know who this might be a portrait of, but maybe someday we will have that information. So here we have our lovely girl with a red hat, which we've posited as a kind of experiment on Vermeer's part, in which he is using that more spontaneous, brushier approach to painting, not just in the underpaint, but in the final visible paint layer. He's choosing to do that in a rather small format, not one of his larger genre paintings. And, he thought, well, this is an experiment. Maybe I won't go out and buy a canvas just for this. Oh, I got this old panel here. I'll just flip it around and paint on top of it. It won't cost me anything. So, we think this is him trying out the next phase in the development of his artistic technique. And there are some features of this painting that become part of his style in the final years of his career. For example, a bolder approach to the contrast of light and shadow, and these contrast of these brighter, more specific highlights, and sort of constructing the face in flat planes rather than smooth modulations as he did earlier in those genre paintings. So once we had that expanded understanding of Girl with the Red Hat, where does that leave us with Girl with a Flute? Now, going into the research, the painting was attributed to Johannes Vermeer. What does that mean? It means that it's very close to the artist, but there's something about it that doesn't give us 100% confidence in saying this was painted by Johannes Vermeer. So the working hypothesis before we began our research was that Vermeer had started this painting, and that sort of laid out the groundwork and done the underpaint, and that somebody else finished it because what we saw on the surface didn't really correspond to, for example, Girl with the Red Hat. Now, we're incredibly fortunate here in having these two paintings, which, as you can see, are so very similar in terms of their conception. Having both of these paintings that we could study side by side and apply the same modalities of investigation to both of them in tandem. So we didn't have to wait on colleagues to do one sort of test while we did something else in-house. So points of similarity. They're both half-length images of young women with a tapestry in the background and a chair with these lion's head finials. They both are wearing large, funny hats that cast a broad shadow over their faces. They're both looking out at the viewer. They're both wearing a blue garment and a white kerchief at their neck. So, I mean, you know, I could be describing either painting just verbally there. But what we wanted to do was to get a really good perspective on what is similar about these two paintings and what is different. So one of the things that we started noticing, or that had been noticed, is that there are some just defects that are visible on the surface of the painting that indicate fatal flaws and really a lack of understanding on the part of the artist about how to use their materials, and whether this was from a lack of experience or just a lack of skill, we don't know. But I'm showing you a couple of details here. There are drying cracks in the area of the blue garment that are likely caused by the surface paint, the final paint, drying more quickly than the underneath layers. So as the underneath layers dried, that caused the surface to pull apart into cracks. Now, I mentioned that Vermeer was, he was adding the dryer verdigris to his paints to get them to dry more quickly in order that he could get to the final paint. So for whatever reason, that didn't entirely happen in this painting. Another thing that was noticed, you may be able to see here, some areas of like wrinkle that suggest that in the underlying layers, there might have been a little too much oil mixed into the paint mixture. And that caused it to wrinkle as it dried. Those wrinkles were then scraped down to smooth out the surface to continue to the final paint. These are things that happen in the process of painting. But an experienced artist like Vermeer would have known how to avoid the likelihood of that happening. Another thing we noticed, we did notice the presence of the chemical element copper. So this artist did use some verdigris in his area of black. And again, you can see that these roughly correspond to areas of shadow, but that he applied it in just kind of arbitrary strokes in a way. And when we compare this to how Vermeer applied the copper-containing black underpaint, it's a much more indicative and understanding of where he wants the folds of that fabric to go. And here, in Girl with a Flute, they're just almost random strokes, if you will. Another thing that we noticed was that there's this sort of odd discrepancy in the texture of the paint layers. Typically, artists, and we know Vermeer did this, in the layers of the painting that you didn't see, they wouldn't necessarily spend the time and energy grinding their pigments ultra fine. And they might go 80% of the way because they weren't ever going to be seen. But for the final surface of the painting, especially if, like Vermeer, you wanted that smooth, elegant, calm surface, you would take care to grind your pigments very fine. This artist sort of did the opposite, and he used more finely ground pigments in the underpaint than he did in the final paint. In some areas, and I'll point this out later on, this gave the surface of his painting an almost granular appearance. And under magnification, you can actually see the individual pigment particles. But even if this artist wasn't Vermeer, they did have an absolute understanding of some of the idiosyncratic qualities of Vermeer's technique. For example, his rather unusual use of the pigment green earth in creating these greenish shadows in the flesh. This is something that Vermeer does periodically throughout his career, but none of his colleagues do. And we found green earth particles also in these greenish shadows of the girl with the flute. So this sort of hints to us that this artist was privy to some of the details or some of the secrets, if you will, of Vermeer's technique, because it's not necessarily something that you would know about or know how to achieve just looking at the surface of Vermeer's paintings. However, when it came to actually using this green earth, there's quite a difference in the handling of the surface paint. So in these details, you can see these almost feathery brush strokes that Vermeer uses, even though he's contrasting somewhat broad planes of light and shadow. He's kind of feathering on the paint itself, whereas the artist of Girl with the Flute is a bit more heavy-handed in how he applies his paints or her paints, not to be gender specific here. So on that theme of differences in the paint handling, just to compare to images of the blue drapery. In Girl with the Red Hat, we see the darker folds, we see brushstrokes creating a pattern in the fabric. Generically, we see the same in Girl with the Flute. But we see warm highlights, we see cool highlights, we see dots and dashes and brush strokes of different sizes and patterns that are really almost intuitively simultaneously creating highlights and a pattern on the fabric. And the same is just not at the same level in Girl with the Flute. Yes, we see, dots of highlights, but not the variation. And as I said, that almost intuitive sense of, he's not even thinking as he's doing it. He just knows the effect he wants to create. I mentioned particles of pigment visible in the final paint, which you can see here in that tiny detail. But what I also wanted to show you are areas where you can see hairs from the brush embedded in the paint. This is not absolutely unique in the realm of historic oil paintings. We do find this, and we even find it in paintings by Vermeer, but not to the extent that we find in Girl with the Flute. This is not, a smoking gun that proves that Vermeer did not paint this, but it may suggest that this artist was kind of scrubbing with his brush, not going about his or her brush, not going about it in the most delicate way, but kind of working into the paint there in kind of an overachieving sort of technique. And I've talked with my colleague Dina Anshin, who is a painter, and she said, yes, the artist could have been using an old brush or a broken brush, or kind of scrubbing and going at it with a bit of bad technique. So where does this leave us? there's so many questions about art that was produced, 400 years ago. But we believe that this painting was produced by someone who had to have been present in Vermeer's workshop as he was painting in order to understand how he layered his paints, the materials that he used, how he achieved some of the effects of light and shadow and color, but just wasn't Vermeer, didn't have the skill or experience to create a painting with the same sophistication and finesse. And when I say this, this doesn't suggest that this is a bad painting and we will never show it. It's a fascinating painting, and I think it's going to be so much fun to display it in the context of other paintings that we know are by Vermeer and spark those sorts of discussions.